Well. What a fascinating conversation there between Baka and Dad and Kiran. Learning a lot around women entrepreneurship and the drive and overcoming barriers, gender barriers, and the courage to just move forward, but also noting that there are many barriers we need to overcome. And today we'll be having a conversation with scientists, female scientists, who've actually made a major difference to the response on COVID-19. Today at the Women in Global Health conference, we are going to be talking around the area of women scientists on the forefront of COVID-19 research. The one thing that I note as we get into this is that there have been many women researchers who've actually participated, not only in the research for therapeutics and vaccines for COVID-19, but also in its response to ensure that people stay safe. When I look at some data, I am reminded that less than 1 in 3 COVID-19 related clinical trials were actually led by women, less than 1 in 3. I am also reminded that women's share in authorship of research papers has decreased compared to the previous season. And in the news and media, whereas we know that within this panel, we are going to have women who've actually been on the forefront again of discussing this issue on the media, we have seen as it's less likely for women to be interviewed or talked to on the media, yet we have female scientists who are on the front lines, who are as educated as men, as experienced as men, and as knowledgeable, and even more than men. Now, I was looking at some data on policy, and I think one of the things I saw on this policy in terms of task forces, let me just share this with you, that just 19% out of 69 task forces in Africa were women. COVID-19 task forces across the continent, only 19% were women. Secondly, if you look at US, it was 29%, Europe 31%. So it seems to be something that cut across, despite the fact that Africa had a much lower number. This kind of male-dominated response of COVID-19 task forces was global. In fact, the UN shared that probably only 25% of all task forces were women, okay? So that is a challenge that we are going to be discussing here. And if truly the pandemic response was to be led by science, was it science for men, by men, about men? And we saw the challenge of this, that whereas the task forces determine certain policy directions, including curfew, lockdown, either full or partial, we saw that those policies lacked a gender lens. We saw women deliver at home because of curfew, because the curfew announcement did not consider that women who are pregnant may need skilled delivery at night and may need transit. And therefore that needed to be considered in the policy declaration. We saw that women lost jobs significantly. And the question is, where were the women policymakers and their role within these task forces? What was their role in the research, in delivery of vaccines? What was their role in direction? We've seen many countries did not vaccinate women quickly because there was the fear that pregnant women should not be vaccinated. And that affected the uptake of vaccines for women, because for a long time, it took time to change that policy direction, despite the fact that global opinion was different. So what I would like to do now is go straight to our great panel here. And this panel of 3 is made up of Dr. Shikoh Gitau, who is here with us. Shikoh is the CEO of Kala. She is from Kenya, where I come from. And then we have Dr. Gagandeep Kang. Dr. Gagandeep, for anyone joining us from India, will know that her videos and participation in the news has been legendary during the COVID-19 pandemic. And she's a professor of microbiology, Division of Gastrointestinal Sciences at the Christian Medical College. And then we have Susan Silbermann, Independent Board Director, Business Advisor. But Dr. Silverman has also been very active in the development of the COVID vaccines at Pfizer, and also at some point was leading the COVID-19 task force on behalf. So we are going to get straight into this conversation. And I see my panelists are all here. I am extremely proud to be chairing a panel of 3 women. Many of you who know me know that I do not participate in manuals, so I refuse to participate. And I am really glad that this one was no-brainer. Now, I want to start off with a question for all of you, because you all have participated during the last 1 year. You've been in the health and science field, worked under immense pressure, developing the products we're using now, but also participating in the response. Can you talk about the one challenge you faced as a leader during the pandemic and how you coped with it? Maybe I could start with Shikoh. As you participated in this conversation, in the task forces, in the advisories, what challenge did you find and how did you cope with it?
So I said, when I was invited for this panel, I asked them, are you sure you want this, Dr. Shikoh? I'm not a medical doctor. And they say, yes, we want you. So I think for me, coming from a non-medical background and working on such a vital point in our history as a humanity was reflective. And so, because our work was basically to use data to help government make decisions. So we will get these questions from the national government asking us, can you help us determine when to close, if to close schools, if to close counties, how big is this county to close? And every day we had to make these decisions that were life and death decisions, literally. And I always tell my medical colleagues that they were battle-hardened by going to medical school to counter some of these things. For me, it was the first time I was doing this. And then people that you know started dying, and those numbers changed for me. They started having a different meaning that, oh my goodness, this person is, we are saying the 891 people, the one is actually somebody I know. And for me, just merging that reality to my work was such a reflective moment from a personal point of view, but also from a leadership point of view, because I lead this group of young people. And for them, at first it was fun saying, oh, the president is reading our report word for word. It was really exciting. And then it started hitting them when somebody in our team actually lost 2 relatives. And it stopped being, oh, we are doing these numbers. We cannot just celebrate our numbers being read by the minister or by the government. It is actually hitting home. And just that psychological shift from saying these numbers are actually a life and death situation was a huge jump for us. And doing that and bringing people along with you, not just the team that I was leading, but also the people around you. They stopped asking, people start asking, when are you going to close the county? When is the curfew going to stop? When is this going to happen? And they start reflecting that you're actually losing people and asking, when are you going to close the county now? Because now it's becoming closer and closer home. So just that journey of you as a I'm a computer scientist and data scientist, and moving from that to the idea that your work actually has meaning that can change people's lives was a big, huge jump for me. And then bringing people along to understand that this is not just a matter of numbers, it's about a matter of your life. You need to take precautions, and communicating this in a way that people understand. So when I got COVID, I live tweeted every single day my experience so that people can know that this is me. I know everything I need to know about COVID, but I still got it. It's about being very taking personal responsibility and personal leadership in countering out COVID. Thank you.
Fantastic. And from now on, I'll call you Shikoh. I'll not call you
Yes,
Dr.
perfect.
Shikoh anymore.
I actually go by Shikoh.
Thank you. And I will also ask Susan Silbermann, I'll call her Susan, and Gagandeep, I'll call you that, so that we make this an easy conversation. So I have your permission. I see the notes. Now, Susan, what was your challenge and how did you overcome that?
So thank you all for inviting me here today to be on such a distinguished panel with a number of of scientists, whether they're data scientists or medical scientists. I too am not a medical doctor. I have worked with medical doctors and clinical researchers my entire career. And so I often spend a lot of time interpreting science for people who are non-scientists. And as the initial leader of the Pfizer internal COVID-19 task force, I can say that probably the biggest challenge I had was just that, communication. I actually spent time in China, was part of my responsibilities, in January of 2020. And as I've told many of my friends and family, I wish I had brought home the newspapers that I was seeing every day there as Wuhan was exploding. And so by the time I got back to the East Coast of the United States, we knew we needed a task force within Pfizer to start to look at not only how to solve the problem of the pandemic, but how to communicate to our colleagues around the world what was happening. And so my goal was to put a small team together to try and stay just maybe one step ahead of where things were going, interpreting what we were learning, what we were seeing from data scientists like Shikoh and others all around the world about the outbreak of this terrible virus. We knew a lot of things about SARS, we knew a lot of things about MERS, but coronaviruses were very unknown, especially in the US and Europe, because that's not where these outbreaks had really happened. But as a global company, we knew we had to stay one step ahead of it. And so it was very much communication. That was the biggest challenge, keeping people apprised of what was happening to our facilities, to our people. I think the comment that Shikoh made about when is it time to close? When is it time to reopen? How to protect yourself? Do we need masks? How do we get masks? Where can we get masks? What kind of masks do we need? Is it transmitted by respiratory? Is it transmitted by touching? How many of us in many parts of the world spent several months wiping down our groceries because we were convinced that that was really the main way we were going to get COVID? So when I think back on this year and a half of how much we didn't know at the beginning and how much we had to use science to sort of guess and listen to scientists, I think my role was very important in translating the science into something that non-scientists like me could understand and transmit not just to our colleagues, but to our families and to our friends.
Well, great. So that is Shikoh, lived experiences and how to handle that with your team and going through the pandemic and leaving the pandemic yourself. Then communication. Now let's hear from Gagandeep, who also told me that actually her other name is Cherry. So over to you, Gagandeep. What was your challenge and how did you overcome it?
Actually, I'll start with what was my first challenge and then the big one. And my first challenge was, I'm a doctor. I work in infectious diseases. I work in viruses. I work in viruses that infect the mucosal tract, but not respiratory viruses. So at least initially, I felt like I was a bit of a fraud to be talking about viral infection and a pandemic. And then I realized that I was probably one of the most qualified people to be talking about viruses, and particularly viruses that were vaccine preventable. So I got started communicating about, uncertainties, what we knew, what we didn't know, how we should interpret what was being told to us, so on and so forth. And I've been doing that ever since. But the biggest challenge for me has been people turning on me when I've questioned what the government has done and calling me unpatriotic, calling me a traitor, saying that I've sold out to a political agenda, that I've sold out to companies that make vaccines. And this is despite the fact that I've spent all of my life in public health at a mission hospital. So you couldn't get anybody who could be less conflicted than I am. And that's been hard to deal with because, you're trying to do the best you can. You believe you're doing a good job. And yet people say that you've been bought by philanthropic foundations and companies and political parties, pretty much anybody who's not them. So that's been hard, but you learn to deal with it and you move on.
Wow, that's a really close home, because I have also had a lot of social media abuse, actually, because of my position on vaccination. And many of us here, I'm sure, have had the same, where you take a position and then the anti-vaxxers and the people who don't believe in COVID, the deniers, then accuse you and abuse you, including colleagues, actually. So that's very close home. So now that we realize and understand all the challenges that we've gone through, I'll come back to Shikoh, because the challenge that we are discussing here is we are all women scientists, women leaders, but we're also talking about barriers and the issue that the pandemic policies were not gender responsive. But we have women here who sat inside the room. Shikoh, you said the president would read your report, for example. Can you give us any example, if there was any, where you used your data analysis to actually influence and make the COVID-19 policy response more inclusive for women and girls? Is there an example you can share?
Yeah, thank you so much, Doc. I think for me, the favorite, it's favorite in terms of the work, not in terms of just the outcomes. So we were doing all this mapping and everybody was working on COVID. And then we said, let's take a step back and look what's the impact of COVID on all these other health indicators and health outcomes. So we went, DHIS2 is the big database for health data in most of Africa. So we took a step back and started looking at what is the effect of COVID on childhood vaccination, on HIV, what's the word? I've forgotten the word, the medication and hospital visits. But the one that struck us the most was effect on gender-based violence. I think the earlier speaker, Kiran, mentioned about gender-based violence in India. In Kenya, it was really, really bad. It was, so think of 2018 and 2019 data combined. 2020 data was more than double of that. And so we are showing this dashboard to the task force, and everybody was like, are those numbers correct? And like, yeah, we reran the model, same numbers appeared. And I've never seen such fast uptake of decision making more than that, because the Ministry of Gender took up a point of doing messaging around gender-based violence, putting up a hotline. We got like calls from many NGOs asking us, can you give us access to that data? Because we need to put programs in place to make sure that women are safe haven that they can run to. And for me, that was a huge one, that just seeing the quick and fast decisions that were made because they saw this dashboard that was showing 2019, 2018, then 2020 was like here. And 2021 has not actually changed. The sad part is that it's not dropped. Gender-based violence actually still high compared to 2018 and 2019. At least slightly lower than 2020, but still quite high compared to those last 2 years. And for me, that was very fulfilling, to be honest, as a woman, because I realized that you hear when you incorporate and when you're in a different position, not in the village, you don't realize how bad things are because we are very good at putting on makeup and running the show. But the women in the village who are not able to do this and are going to hospital with their friends were not getting the care that they wanted. And I say in a small way, we were able to influence that. I will save a life or two. The other flip side of it was when we did the same study and ran a model on teenage pregnancies. Our data showed that there was no increase in teenage pregnancies in 2020. And we went through this model, then we talked to our colleagues in the clinical side and asked them, okay, these headlines after headlines of increased teenage pregnancy, what's happening here? Because the numbers are not matching the headlines in the newspaper. And the one thing that hit us was maybe the numbers are not high because the teenagers are not going to hospital to report that they're pregnant. So their parents and their social communities are actually saying, we have 5 pregnant people who are under the age of 18 in our village. but they're not going to the clinic for prenatal care, which is quite worrying because you're wondering, what are these children going to do when it's time to giving birth? What is going to happen to those babies if they have not been taken care of on prenatal care? So for me, those were the two things. One that really showed almost instant action and policy changes, and another one that it's still a slow burn. I think it's going to continue for another year because teenage pregnancy is still persistent even in 2021, and all the other psychosocial stuff that is happening around teenage mental health that's happening in Kenya. I wish we had caught it earlier and reacted to it when we were arguing around, are they going to hospital or are these numbers not right, and taken an action at that point. Thank you so much, Doc.
Thank you, Shikoh. And before I move on to ask Susan the next question, I would just like to, maybe in a minute or less, did you find that by being a female scientist, that your decision making, your data analysis, and how you are leading this had actually a female skew? Did you find that you had a gender skew or a gender bias in terms of the analysis you're doing, or did you find that you're actually fairly neutral? Just something interesting I would like to hear from you.
No, I was 100% gender biased, especially when it came to these two issues of teenage pregnancy and gender-based violence. I think when we were doing this deck, the way you're trying to present your deck in a manner that you want to influence a certain decision making. Gender was first, then childhood, and the teenage pregnancy was second, because we wanted action to be taken. And for me, it was like this: I could empathize with the women at any of this level. As a young woman who's not able to go to find help because they just can't, because they're a young African girl in the village, I could easily identify with that girl, and I could empathize with women who are undergoing violence in their households and they have nowhere else to run. So yes, 100%, although I have like a very strong female but also mixed team, they tried taping it down, but yes, it was very gender, it was highly influenced by being female.
Good. So that speaks to the fact that when we have women in global health leadership, then policies are more likely to be to favor and to be biased towards women, and that's okay, because I keep saying that we have to be unfair to be fair, because women have been left behind for too long. Therefore, you have to be unfair to be fair. So I wanted to confirm that hypothesis in my head.
Can I add something?
Yes,
Doc?
yes, Shikoh, please add.
So actually, my colleague Lois, she's called Dr. Lois Ombajo, when we did this modeling and showed this gender-based violence, she's the one who actually went to the DG and the CS of health and even presented in front of the NAC, the national team, saying, look at what's happening. I mean, she just pushed for it to for action to be taken, because we're saying we cannot have women being abused at home. And I like that, because I feel like if it was a male, or like, yeah, are these numbers correct, would have been at that point. But actually being female made some of this decision make, because women were really biased towards action on this one.
Women leaders in global health. This is the conversation. And please remember that we have the Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We are going to have about 10 minutes to try and answer your questions or put your comments on as we continue with this conversation. And now I come straight to Susan, because Susan has been very instrumental in development of the Pfizer vaccine, which we are talking about. And thank you, Susan, for the work you've done around this, and also your leadership of the COVID task force within Pfizer. But did you find that when you sat in those rooms and you led this, did you find that within the organization or even the ecosystem that actually the expectations of female leaders changed? Did you find that maybe there were more expectations, or that people still struggled with it, or there was no change at all? And if there was any change in the expectations, how are these changes that you may have noticed?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the scientists that worked on the vaccines at Pfizer and many other parts of the ecosystem that have developed both the vaccines and now some treatments for COVID-19, they were always there. It's not like they just popped up like mushrooms when COVID-19 emerged. Very strong scientific background, very strong scientific research, very strong accomplishments even before COVID-19. I think what happened during the pandemic, and what continues to happen, is the spotlight has naturally gravitated towards them, because they are the ones pioneering the research. I like to say that probably history should look back soon, if not already, and look at how many women were engaged in cracking the code of the COVID-19 virus to make sure that people had the data. Scientists all around the world, whether they're in companies, in academia, in governments, that code was cracked by a lot of women scientists. And so I think the key here is to realize that scientists come in many flavors, men and women, black and white, older and younger. Some people that have transitioned from one kind of science to another to be able to join together as a global community and fight this pandemic. And I do think that the women that have been at the forefront are finally getting that spotlight. Many of these women, when you read their stories, they have tremendous accomplishments before COVID, but nobody saw them because either they didn't have the chance to speak up, or when they spoke up, it wasn't the global stage. So what I do hope is that all of this will lead to more women wanting to be a part of global health, more women wanting to be scientists, to be researchers, to be communicators, to be data scientists, to be medical doctors. The goal should be much more a parity when it comes to these types of professions. And as you said, you have to be unfair to be fair. I like what you said, Githinji. I think that's really important. Women have been in the shadows for way too long. And if nothing else, COVID has taken them out of the shadows. And that's really great.
Fantastic, Susan. Maybe one last question to you before I move on to Cherry is how many people within your COVID-19 task force within Pfizer, what was the gender balance? How many men versus women?
I think if I remember correctly, it was exactly half. And I picked people for my original task force that I knew very well, that I could trust, that I had come from different disciplines, different parts of the world, especially since the beginning of the task force, we were primarily dealing with Asia. So I had a lot of people that were on the ground in Asia, knew what was going on, but it was a very balanced task force. It was not primarily women. It wasn't primarily men. It was both.
Good. Thank you very much, Susan. And Cherry, tell me, of course, you are in everyone's living room on TV talking about this, and you've been a woman scientist and leader for a long time. Did you bring any lessons from being a woman scientist and from being a woman? Did you bring any of these lessons to your approaches to building community trust for COVID-19 response and for vaccines? What would you like to share about this so that we know exactly how you brought in your gender lens to dealing with the response of the COVID-19?
Thanks for that question, Githinji. Yeah, I heard what you asked Susan, and I have to tell you that the Supreme Court of India appointed a national task force 6 months ago to look into the oxygen crisis and all the other activities related to the pandemic. It was a 12-person task force, and there was one woman on it, me. So that's kind of par for the course for most committees in India. It's very rare to have more than one woman on these committees. But I think even in the communication around the task force, I think one of the things that, the bottom of the pyramid is always invisible. And if the bottom of the pyramid in healthcare is made up largely of women, then it becomes even more invisible. So in India, we have ASHA workers. They're called accredited social health activists. They're supposed to be volunteers, but they are the front line of all of public health for India. And they're all women. And a lot of them are older women, uneducated women, and they were sent out to track COVID-19 cases, to encourage people to come in for tests, to communicate about vaccines with no personal protective equipment. So highlighting these kinds of things, the fact that you would never do that if it was male healthcare workers. You would never think about inadequate training if there was a structured system that was not completely reliant on women volunteering or women receiving very tiny honoraria to be able to fulfill these functions. So I think in terms of communicating the role of women in handling the crisis, there have been a number of people that have tried to emphasize that it's been a very, very unequal approach. And when it comes to looking at other interventions that are relevant to women, take, for example, vaccinating pregnant women. I sit on the committees that are responsible for deciding on or making recommendations for vaccination strategies. To persuade a committee full of men that pregnant women need to be vaccinated is an uphill battle. But fortunately, I also sit on advisory committees for a couple of states where I was able to emphasize that it was important that women get vaccinated and get vaccinated early. So of the 2 states where I was formally an advisor, the gender gap in immunization was the least in the country. So I'm not saying I'm not responsible for that, but certainly repeatedly getting the message out could not have hurt.
Wow.
I'll stop.
So Cherry, there's a question for you because I want you to continue with that line of conversation. One of our participants has asked a question regarding what you talked about earlier, about the abuse and on social media. And somebody wants to hear from you. Do you think it's more likely that women are more likely to be attacked on social media than men? I would like to hear your comment on that.
That's not a question. Of course they are. We live in a deeply misogynistic society. So we are going to get more attacked. Women should know their place, and it's not on a TV camera.
So how do you advise then women to deal with it? Because you experienced it. How do you deal with it? Because it's also a cause of mental stress. How did you deal with it yourself, and how do you advise women to deal with it?
The first few times were hard, and I know that a lot of people have been through it as part of their profession. I wasn't used to it as a scientist, but it just required to take on the same things that I did early in my career, which is develop a thicker skin and believe that if it mattered to me, I needed to carry on.
Great. I think that's a good. Susan, would you like to? Did you experience these things yourself, or even Shikoh? And how do you advise her to deal with this? Because what Cherry has said is that we live in an extremely misogynistic world, and I like to say that for us men, we are victims of privilege because we don't see. We are like, I mean, what do you mean? What are you talking about? What's the problem? But for women, they live these experiences of segregation and non-inclusion. So I would like to hear from you. How would you advise people to deal with this kind of attack, social media, when you have an opinion, and also within your task force? Of course, I don't want to call out your colleagues, but have you experienced this thing that because you have more skewed attacks because you're female, either in a committee, in a board, or even in public? I would like to hear from Susan, then I hear from Shikoh. And Susan, you had another comment to add. You can feel free to do so at the same time.
One thing that I wanted to say, and I think it's important for it to be said, especially for so many of the people joining the conference from all over the world, the reason we're having conferences like this, and it's called Women Leaders in Global Health, not just Leaders in Global Health, is as women, we have passed our entire careers always with that adjective in front of the noun. I'm sure that Githinji has never been called a male leader or a male doctor. You're just a leader. But for us, we're a woman leader, or we're a women president, or we're a woman scientist. And I think, that's always has called us out as separate and different. And I would like us to be separate but equal. I don't mind that you have to add female, because I think many of us are hardwired that when we hear the word leader, in English at least, the pronoun we would use is he, because we just assume it's a man. But I think this pandemic has shown us, and I hope it stays that way, that the world stage is full of non-men, i.e. women, who have been really leading the charge. And one of the things I learned many years ago when I did work in leadership is, especially important for women and young girls, is you can't be what you can't see. So to Sherry's comment about being the only woman on a committee, how many of us have experienced that throughout our careers and our lives? But at least she's there. So if a young girl is watching television that day and sees the whole committee and sees one woman in the room, that may spark her interest in becoming a scientist. And so I think it's upon all of us, those of us speaking, but most importantly, those of us in the audience today, to make sure that we celebrate leaders who may not be the majority, that one day we will be at parity. I've always said that women really want half the seats. We don't want 80% or 90% like men have had. We just would like our voices heard. We'd like half of those seats. And we think our perspective is different than the male perspective. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, but different because we have different life experiences. And so I do think that this pandemic has shown us the ability to speak up, has given us that platform that we've sought for so long, because so many of us have been in the room where it happened on many occasions, in many different settings, in many different parts of the world. And I think it's important that we continue to shine that spotlight so that one day conferences like this will be called Leaders in Global Health, and there will be men and women, and it won't have to be the showcase, but until it is that way, we need to keep showcasing the contribution women make to leadership, to science, to research. You name the field, women are making contributions all over the world.
That's a great way to reflect on that. And again, reminding us of how privilege drives our conversations. Because for me, as a man sitting here, I didn't actually realize that, these are women leaders and not just leaders in global health, So it's privilege in our head. And this is also the same privilege that informs conversations like Black woman gets a PhD in computer science, whereas it's just a person who got a PhD in computer science who is called Shikoh, or gay minister, that's 1, 2, 3, whereas, their sexuality has nothing to do with their performance. So it's layered privilege. So Shikoh, do you want to comment on this issue very quickly as we come to an end? And there is a final question that I want to ask to both Shikoh and Susan, because somebody has asked, how do you build your credibility in the health sector without being medical professionals? Just a quick tip from each one of you. Over to you, Shikoh.
So it's interesting that you asked about that. So maybe every month, or nowadays it's tapered off because there's Google and people use it more often. But I'll get these emails, dear Dr. Shikoh, and then the reference is him, he, who. And because people just assume because I'm a scientist and I'm doing this computer science thing, I'm actually a man. And just being, so I talked to a few of my mentors and said, how do I make sure that people know I'm a woman from the very beginning? So I remember I worked with this very old organization, and also make sure you wear the brightest colored clothing such that you're not swallowed in the gray and black suits. So I made it a point to wear like the brightest clothes to make sure that I'm not swallowed in the black and gray suits, so that I stand out as a woman and just embrace my femininity. And on the second question is, how do I build credibility? I build by being authentic. Like when I started the conversation, I said, I know I'm not a medical doctor. I will not be able to comment. Although I do joke that I can be a quack now, a medical quack, because I've learned so many terminologies in medicine over the past 2 years. But I understand that I am not a medical doctor, so I don't comment on data, and always try and learn what is relevant to make sure that we have moved the needle when it comes to data and health outcomes. But I'm very clear that I ask questions. I am very authentic around, I don't know what you guys are talking about. Can you help me understand? And I think medical doctors like explaining a lot of the terminology. So I get along with them because they have long terminologies that they try and train me. So with that, and then I make sure that when I'm talking to audiences that is not medical, I always reference people who I've worked with to make sure that credibility is borrowed from people who are actually quite trained. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm coming to the end of this. I know we have 5 minutes, but I think the organizers are being a bit generous with their time, but I don't have to go too far over time. I just want to ask each one of you, and I want to start with Cherry. There is something my wife actually taught me. My wife is a communications expert, and she taught me that in their first class of communications, they were told that the dominant culture always wins. And she referred to a book that actually has a story regarding this that was part of their text. And the reason I'm asking this is that when I look at the cabinet meeting that held conversations around policies in Africa and elsewhere, because they were predominantly men, it didn't mean there were no women. But yet, the policy declaration had no gender lens at all. You know, when you announce curfew, but you don't actually put a rider and say, if you are pregnant and you need whatever, this is the number you call, so that there's transit. And there were women, never mind there could have been one, as Cherry said, or two or three, they would have actually brought in and say, hey, before you conclude the policy, can you put a disclaimer and say, if a woman is pregnant, this is her transition. But that never happened, which then reminds me that the dominant culture always wins, meaning that if the dominant culture is masculine in the room, the policy will be masculine. So I want each one of you to comment on how you experience this dominant culture, how you tended to overcome it, or whether you became a victim of it yourself. Can I start with, let me start with Cherry, then go to Susan, close with Shikoh, and then we close this panel. Over to you, Cherry.
No question. And I think one of the things that's really important to do is for women to quantify how much their gender holds them back. So for people like Shikoh who develop quantitative tools, tell us how to measure how many years we lose because of what happens to us because of gender. This is the big things. The harassment, of course, we can describe very well, but all of the microaggressions, all of the lack of promotions, all of the lack of considerations of the things that women need, I think we will find that this places us at a substantial disadvantage at every step of our career.
Thank you very much. Susan, over to you, and then we close with Shikoh.
Sure. I think one of the very important things that have been said today is that women really are contributing, but the challenge in having our contributions seen is a lot about communication, as you said. And so I think there are a lot of strategies women have developed, and you have to be bold about them. So if you're in that room that Sherry described where you're the only woman and you have a comment, you make it, no one hears you, and then 3 minutes later, a man makes a similar comment, you have to stand up and say, I am so glad that Githinji just played back exactly what I said 5 minutes ago. You have to remind people that your voice is just as strong, even if the dominant culture might be male, even if people may not realize and they're not doing it out of malice. It's just a mechanism that we all have. And I think as women, we've learned even when we're 2 or 3 in the room, we band together. So we reinforce each other. So if Shikoh makes a comment, I pipe up right away and say, Shikoh, that is a great comment. Let's expand on that in the room. And then Sherry would say the same thing. So women have developed a lot of great strategies to make sure that our voices come up in a room that may not be the dominant culture, being a female culture. But I do think it's important for women to start to really stand their ground and to not sit in the back row, to sit at the table, as they say. That's another important point. Women tend to sit in the second row. Women need to take a seat right at the table. And I think we're going to continue to see that. And again, as I said, I think so many women around the world in positions like Shikoh's and like Cherry's have contributed to getting the world through this pandemic. And I know we're not through it yet, that I think we need to stay engaged and make sure that our voices are not lost. And hats off to all the women scientists who have developed vaccines and treatments and ways to manage patients, and the frontline workers all around the world. So many of them are women. The Ashas that I've actually seen in action in India in one of my many trips, critical to the healthcare of a country like India. So I'm really encouraged by what I've seen so far, and I hope we can continue to bring women forward as scientists and trusted conversation partners.
Thank you so much, Susan. And Shikoh, to you, and maybe in your response, you could just put a quick comment on a question that we've received around why you think women have excelled so much in communication around the pandemic. And as Susan has said, the women are always there. It's just that the pandemic has spotlighted them because they have actually been at the forefront of communication. And we are seeing that. So you could comment on that as well. But over to you for your 2-minute remark or 1-minute remark.
Thank you. So I think Susan and I don't know how to say it in Gagandeep, have echoed what I was saying, and I'm going to echo because it's one of the many strategies that you have to use as a woman. Is you will echo other women to amplify their voice, and I have learned that if you amplify another woman's voice, your voice totally actually is amplified because you keep echoing each other's voice, so you not be muffled down out of your voice. And the second thing is just embracing that you're female, but being female does not mean being timid and quiet. It's sometimes being loud and quite opinionated, and being able to wear that label and allowing others to label you that. And being opinionated because you have your facts, you have your numbers, you have everything outlined for you. So for me, that is very, very important, is that we are echoing each other. We are making sure that our voices are being heard, that opinion that Susan or Gagandeep or Githinji has said is being said over and over again until it is heard. And if you're in the position of power, so if in the position of power to be the person on the podium, amplify that other woman's voice, call them out and say, Susan, you had a point to say. Even if they had no point to say, just put them on the spotlight. They'll have something to say at that time. And it's these strategies, you learn and you pick them up, because that's the exact same strategies that guys use. We're just reusing them for ourselves and for our own benefit. In terms of communication, I've learned that women get muffled because we don't own our own voice. We get other people to offer our opinion. So I'm writing a paper, and because Dr. Githinji is well known, I want my opinion to be, I'll be a second author, he'll be the first author, so that our paper is actually seen because of his name. What if you ask Dr. Githinji, can you be the second author for the same exact purpose, but can I be the first author? Just pushing and making sure that you're communicating. If you're communicating about our work, we're saying we did this with Dr. Githinji, not Dr. Githinji did this with us. Making sure that you're amplifying your voice as a woman and making sure that you own your voice and you don't give that voice to another person to own. And then helping other younger women own their own voices and just amplifying them. I always say echoing it out, because an echo makes it louder and undeniable. Thank you.
Fantastic. Amplify women, amplify their voices, sit at the table. Spotlight has been important for women, though they were always there. They didn't grow up and emerge like mushrooms, as Susan. They were always there. These are the things we need to put at the back of our minds. And we have to remember that women are not contributing. They are women because they are women. They are contributing because they contribute. They are knowledgeable. They are trained in their own right. That is the reason women are contributing. And therefore, it's not tokenism. It's about giving women their rightful place. And as I close this has been such a fantastic panel. I ask all of you to give us a virtual standing ovation to our panelists, Cherry, Susan, and Shikoh, and hats off to all the women who've made COVID-19 bearable for all of us. Thank you all. Enjoy, and please continue being safe and supporting the response. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Over to you, Baka.
Thank you so much, Githinji. That was a fascinating conversation, and there was so much that resonated. I heard Susan make a reference to the ASHA workers in India, and I was just thinking that they were the first line of defense in the COVID response, and actually remain underpaid, under-rewarded, have actually been protesting on the streets as a community of women several times and barely even making it to the news headlines. So there is this kind of invisibilization of women at the grassroots that happens in not just structures of power, but even in our mainstream media, that I do hope that conferences like this one help shine a light on. Listening very carefully to Gagandeep as she spoke about the lack of equity in access to vaccines. There's actually a Yale University study that breaks this down further and shows that the absence of equity in access to technology is also a starting point for these inequities in healthcare. In India, at least in countries like India and many developing countries, many more men, for example, have access to smartphones than women. So you can keep slicing this like an onion, and one more layer of inequality will emerge. But this was an absolutely fascinating conversation with Shikoh, Susan, Gagandeep, Cherry, and thank you, Githinji, for navigating it so deftly and throwing up so many important things, including the fact that women often muzzle our own voices, and we're apologetic and defensive and often embarrassed about being loud. Yesterday, the theme was that more women should make trouble. I think today the theme should be against the muzzle, not just against the muzzling, but in favor and support of louder and louder women. All right, it is time now for our breakout sessions, for our workshops. This is driven by our belief that you can organize yourselves into smaller groups and have more meaningful, deeper conversations. Please refer back now to the agenda. You can find that on the top of your navigation bar. Please do choose the issues and the subjects that draw you the most. Remember, some do have a cap on the number of participants that are permitted. So we do encourage you to go quickly through the agenda and choose your areas of interest. If you have not, do break out into the smaller workshops, discussion rooms, agenda tables that are now available for a deeper dive into some of these issues that we've been talking about over the course of the last day and a half. I leave you now to enjoy the rest of the afternoon, but we'll be back soon to introduce you to our spotlight speakers. It's been fascinating and educative, and I'm sure you're enjoying it as much as I am. I'm going to see you all now after the breakout sessions in a couple of hours from now. Have fun.